My name is Sam Coleman. I am 57 years old. For 30 of those years, I was a law enforcement officer with the United States Forest Service, stationed mostly in the sprawling national forests of the Appalachian mountain range. I've tracked poachers in the dead of winter, faced down armed drug growers in hidden hollows, and coordinated search and rescue operations in terrain so vertical you had to use your hands as much as your feet. I say all this not to brag, but to establish a baseline. I am not a man given to flights of fancy. I am grounded in the observable, the tangible. I know what a black bear looks like up close. I know the sound a mountain lion makes when it's cornered. I know the difference between the snap of a twig under a deer's hoof and the snap of one under a man's boot. What I experienced 3 years ago in the Unicoi Mountains does not fit into any of those known categories.
And it's the reason I no longer live within 100 miles of any significant tree line. It was our annual trip, the first week of November, just me and Jake. Jake Murphy and I had come up through the service together, partners for the better part of 2 decades. We retired within 6 months of each other. The trip was our tradition, a way to shed the quiet of our new civilian lives and feel the old familiar rhythm of the woods. This time, however, Jake had asked if his cousin could tag along, a young man named Brian, maybe 28 or 29. Jake said he was a good kid, just a little green, an accountant from the city who'd gotten into hunting through YouTube videos and wanted some real-world experience. I was hesitant. Our trip was about quiet and familiarity, and a novice changes the dynamic, but I agreed for Jake's sake. The cabin belonged to Jake's family, a relic from the 30s tucked away in a deep valley miles from the nearest paved road. Getting there was an ordeal in itself. You took the state highway until it turned to gravel, then followed that for 10 miles until you hit a dirt track marked by a faded metal sign that just said, Murphy. From there, it was another 5 miles of ruts and rocks that required a high-clearance 4-wheel drive and a patient driver. The isolation was the point. There was no cell service, no electricity save for a noisy gas generator out back, and no neighbors. Just the cabin, the creek that ran beside it, and 1 million acres of government land stretching out in every direction. It was our sanctuary. We arrived in the late afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the valley. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. Brian was practically bouncing in the passenger seat of my truck, his eyes wide as he took in the sheer scale of the wilderness. He was kitted out in brand new camouflage, top to bottom, with a rifle that looked like it cost more than my first car. He talked a little too much, a little too loud, asking questions about game trails and wind direction that he'd clearly memorized from a book. Jake shot me an apologetic look, but I just shrugged. We were all young once. The boy's enthusiasm, while grating, was a reminder of a time when these woods felt like nothing but a grand adventure. We spent the first evening settling in. We unloaded our gear, filled the water cistern from the creek, and chopped enough wood to keep the big stone fireplace fed for a week. Jake and I worked with the easy, unspoken coordination of long partnership, while Brian mostly tried to stay out of the way, occasionally offering to help with a task we'd already completed. Later, as dusk settled like a heavy blanket over the valley, we sat on the porch, drinking coffee. The generator hummed its monotonous tune out back, powering the single bare bulb that lit the main room. Brian was telling a story about his office, and I found my attention drifting, listening to the woods wake up for the night. The calls of owls, the distant yip of a coyote pack. It was a symphony I knew by heart. That was the last normal night, the last time that ancient valley felt like a friend. The next morning we were up before dawn. The plan was to split up. I would take the high ridge to the east, Jake would follow the creek south into a marshy bottomland he favored, and Brian would stick to a well-marked trail on the western slope. We gave him a radio, a map, and strict instructions not to wander off the path. He was looking for a buck, but his real job was to just sit, listen, and learn.
We agreed to meet back at the cabin by midday. I remember clapping him on the shoulder before I left. He had a determined look on his face, a city kid trying to prove himself. It's one of the last clear images I have of him. The morning was uneventful for me. I saw a few does and a young spike buck, but nothing worth taking. The woods were quiet, peaceful. I returned to the cabin a little after noon. Jake was already there, his rifle leaning against the wall. He had a strange expression on his face, not alarmed, but puzzled. He told me to come look at something he'd found down by the creek, not half a mile from the cabin. Brian wasn't back yet, but he had until 2 o'clock before we'd start to worry. I left my pack inside and followed Jake. He led me to a small clearing near the water's edge. The place was a wreck. The ground was torn up, bushes were flattened, and there was a smell in the air, coppery and sharp. In the center of the clearing was what was left of a large, white-tailed buck. And I do mean what was left. I've seen hundreds of predator kills in my career. Bears, cougars, coyotes. They all have a signature. A bear will often partially bury its kill. A cougar goes for the neck and eats the organs first. This was different. The buck had been, for lack of a better word, dismantled. Its legs were broken, snapped at the joints like dry branches. The rib cage was cracked open with incredible force, the contents scooped out. But the head and neck were almost untouched, aside from one long, deep gouge running from its ear to its shoulder. What was most disturbing were the long bones of the legs. They had been shattered, split lengthwise, and the marrow was gone. That's not something an animal does. Not a bear, not a cat. It's something a human might do if they were starving. It was profoundly wrong. Jake and I circled the carcass, not talking. We were both processing the scene through the filter of our experience, and both of us were coming up empty. The sheer violence of it was one thing. The specific nature of the damage was another entirely. There were no drag marks leading into the clearing. It was as if the buck had been killed right there. And there were no tracks. Not a single clear print in the soft earth around the kill. The ground was scuffed and trampled, but there was no definitive sign of a bear or a mountain lion. Just a chaotic mess. "What the hell does that?" Jake finally said, his voice low. He was looking at one of the shattered femurs. "I have no idea," I admitted. We stood there for a long time. The woods around us had gone completely silent. Not the usual midday quiet, but a heavy, listening silence. The kind that comes when every bird and squirrel has gone to ground because a major predator is on the move. The air felt thick, charged. It was the first prickle of real unease, the feeling that we were looking at something that didn't belong in our world. We decided to head back to the cabin. We'd wait for Brian, and then we'd have a serious discussion about whether we were cutting the trip short. Brian stumbled back to the cabin around 1:30, flushed and excited. He hadn't seen anything, but he'd heard something. A loud crack, he said, like a tree falling, but sharper. It had come from the direction of the high ridge where I'd been. He'd gotten spooked and decided to come back early. We didn't tell him about the buck. There was no point in scaring him. Jake and I just exchanged a look. The unease was turning into a low hum of dread. That afternoon we stayed close to the cabin. The mood had shifted. Brian's initial excitement had curdled into a nervous energy, and Jake and I were both on edge. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a poacher, someone who'd shot the buck and then done... what? Smashed it to pieces with a sledgehammer? It made no sense. Maybe it was a diseased bear acting erratically. But again, the evidence didn't fit. The snapped bones were the sticking point. The force required was immense. As evening approached, I took a walk around the immediate perimeter of the cabin, my rifle in my hands. I wasn't hunting anymore. I was scanning the tree line, my senses on high alert. The woods felt different. Watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. I found a set of tracks near the woodpile behind the generator. They were huge, and they stopped me cold. The print was pressed deep into a patch of soft mud. It was oblong, about 16 inches long. It had 5 distinct toes, each tipped with a mark that suggested a heavy, non-retractable claw. But the shape was all wrong for a bear. A bear print is wider, more rounded, with the toes in a gentle arc. This was longer, narrower, and the stride was impossible. I found another partial print nearly 7 feet away from the first. It wasn't a 4-legged animal. This thing was walking on 2 legs. I knelt, my heart pounding in my chest. I placed my own hand, which is not small, inside the track. It was dwarfed. I called Jake over, keeping my voice low. He came out, saw the print, and his face went pale. He didn't say a word. He just looked from the track to the darkening woods, then back to me. Brian came to the door, asking what we were looking at. Jake just told him to get back inside. We didn't have to fake our reasoning anymore. There was something out there. Something big, something we didn't understand, and it had been within 20 feet of our cabin. We went inside and locked the door. We barred the heavy wooden shutters over the windows. The cabin was built like a small fortress, a product of its time, but it suddenly felt terribly flimsy. We sat in the dim light of the single bulb, the generator's hum a frail shield against the oppressive silence that had once again fallen outside. Brian was scared now. The bravado was gone, replaced by a jittery fear that was almost as dangerous. He wanted to know what we'd seen. We told him about the tracks, trying to downplay the strangeness of them. We said it was probably just a big bear, and we were being cautious. He didn't look convinced. He kept glancing at the shuttered windows, his knuckles white where he gripped the stock of his fancy rifle. The night started quietly. For a few hours, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the hum of the generator. We tried to make small talk, but the conversation kept dying. Every creak of the old cabin's timbers made us jump. Around 10 o'clock it started. A faint scratching sound from the front of the cabin. It was rhythmic, methodical. Scratch, pause. Scratch, pause. Like a dog wanting to be let in, but the sound was too high up on the door, and the pressure behind it felt too heavy. Jake and I grabbed our rifles. Brian was frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with terror. I motioned for him to be quiet, putting a finger to my lips. I crept to the door, my ear close to the thick wood. The scratching stopped. I could hear breathing. A low, wet, snuffling sound, right on the other side of the door. It wasn't the pant of a bear. It was a slow, deep inhalation, followed by a long, rattling exhalation, like a creature with a massive chest cavity. My blood ran cold. Then came a new sound, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards. It was deeper than any animal I had ever heard, a guttural rumble that spoke of immense size and deep-seated aggression. It wasn't a warning growl. It was a sound of possessive, predatory confidence. The sound of something that knew it was outside and we were inside, and that the door was only a temporary inconvenience. Suddenly, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately, back and forth, back and forth. My mind struggled to process it. Bears don't turn doorknobs. No animal I knew of possessed that kind of dexterity and reasoning.
This wasn't a dumb beast bumping against a barrier.
This was an intelligent creature testing a mechanism. It was trying to figure out how to open the door. Jake had moved to my side, his own rifle aimed at the door. He looked at me, his face a mask of disbelief and fear. We were so far beyond our experience now that all our years in the woods felt useless. We were dealing with something new, something impossible. The rattling of the knob stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then a tremendous thud hit the door, shaking the entire front wall of the cabin. It sounded like someone had swung a battering ram. Brian let out a choked cry. I spun around and hissed at him to shut up. Panic was a luxury we couldn't afford. Another massive blow struck the door, and this time we heard the wood splinter. The heavy deadbolt was holding, but the frame itself was starting to give. Then, a scraping noise started at one of the side windows. We had barred them with 2x4s, but whatever was out there was now testing a new point of entry.
Jake moved to cover the window while I stayed focused on the door. The generator outside was still running, a small comfort in the growing chaos. At least we had light. The scraping at the window became more frantic, and then we heard a new sound, a high-pitched, chittering vocalization. It was answered by another, different growl from the front of the cabin. They were communicating. There were at least 2 of them. That's when I got my first partial glimpse. A massive, dark shape blotted out the sliver of moonlight visible through a crack in the window shutter Jake was guarding. It was just a silhouette, but the proportions were utterly wrong. A huge, broad set of shoulders, a head that was too large and vaguely canine, and an arm that seemed far too long as it reached up and tore at the shutter. The wood groaned and splintered under the assault. The blows on the front door stopped. The creature there had apparently moved to join the other one.
Now all the force was concentrated on that one window. The 2x4 we'd nailed across it was bowing inward. Splinters of wood flew into the room. Brian was muttering to himself, a litany of, "Oh God, oh God." Jake yelled at him to get his rifle ready, to aim at the window. "Shoot whatever comes through," he shouted, his voice tight with strain. The shutter suddenly ripped away from the wall with a shriek of tortured metal and wood, leaving only the glass of the window pane between us and the night. For a split second, a face was framed there, illuminated by the light from inside, and in that moment, my understanding of the world shattered completely. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I could name. The head was fundamentally canine, like that of a monstrously oversized wolf or German shepherd with a long snout and pointed ears. But the eyes were wrong. They were set forward in the skull, not to the sides, and they glowed with a sickly yellow-green light. They were intelligent, calculating. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of a monster. The creature's shoulders were impossibly broad, wider than the window frame, covered in coarse, dark fur. It drew back, and then its fist, a hand, a grotesquely human-like hand with 5 long fingers tipped with thick black claws, smashed through the glass. Shards sprayed across the floor. Brian screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet. The creature reached its impossibly long arm through the broken window, sweeping blindly. The claws raked across the opposite wall, leaving deep gouges in the log construction. Jake fired his rifle. The blast was deafening in the small cabin. The creature let out a roar, a sound that was half wolf howl, half human scream, and pulled its arm back out. But it wasn't deterred. A moment later, a second, slightly smaller creature appeared at the window next to the first one. We were being besieged by a pack. Then, the worst thing happened. The steady, comforting hum of the generator out back sputtered and died. The single light bulb flickered and went out, plunging us into absolute darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the shattered window
and the dying orange glow from the fireplace. A heavy silence descended, broken only by our ragged breathing. Outside, we heard a low, guttural sound that might have been laughter. They had done it on purpose. They had recognized the generator as the source of our light and had disabled it. "Flashlights!" I yelled, fumbling for the one on my belt. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unclip it. I found the switch and a powerful beam cut through the darkness. Jake did the same. We swept the beams across the broken window. They were gone. The space was empty. But they weren't gone. They were just being smart. They were using the darkness they had created. "Brian, where are you?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. A whimpering sound came from the corner of the room. "I want to go home," he sobbed. "We need to barricade that window," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, procedural. "The table. Help me with the table." We shoved the heavy oak dining table against the wall, blocking the broken window. It was a flimsy defense, but it was something. We were trapped. They were outside, they were intelligent, and they were patient. We spent the next hour in the dark, listening. The only light came from our flashlight beams, which we used sparingly to conserve batteries, and the embers in the hearth. The creatures were moving around the cabin, their heavy footfalls thudding on the hard-packed earth. We could hear them sniffing at the walls, their claws occasionally scraping against the logs. They were testing the whole structure, looking for another weakness. Then we heard a new noise. It came from the roof. A heavy scraping, thumping sound, as if something was crawling across the tin sheeting. They were on the roof. My heart hammered against my ribs. The cabin had an old stone chimney. It was wide enough for a man to climb down, a design from a century ago. We had a fire going, but it had burned down to mostly coals. Not enough to stop something determined. Jake must have had the same thought. He pointed his flashlight beam up at the chimney flue. "No way," he breathed. As if in answer, a shower of soot and debris fell down into the fireplace, hissing on the hot embers. Something was up there, trying to get in. This was the moment Brian broke. With a wild cry, he scrambled to his feet. "I'm not dying in here," he screamed. Before either of us could stop him, he ran to the back door, the one leading to the small utility room where we kept the wood. He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking. "Brian, no!" I shouted, lunging for him. But I was too late. He threw the door open and bolted into the small back room. The outer door in that room was weaker than the front. We heard him frantically trying to unbar it. Then we heard a crash as the outer door was smashed inward from the outside, as if hit by a truck. Brian let out one last, terrible, gurgling scream. It was cut off abruptly. There was a sound of a brief, violent struggle, of splintering wood and a wet, tearing noise. Then silence. A profound, terrifying silence. Jake was standing beside me, his face a ghostly white in the flashlight beam. We both knew what had just happened. Brian was gone. His panic had been his death sentence, and he had just created a new opening into our fortress. We didn't have time to grieve or panic. We slammed the interior door to the utility room shut and threw the bolt. Immediately, a heavy weight slammed against it from the other side. A deep, snarling growl echoed through the wood. One of them was in the back room. It was inside the cabin's outer shell. We dragged a heavy chest of drawers and wedged it against the door, but we knew it wouldn't hold for long. The creature in the back room began to systematically destroy the door. We could hear the wood splitting and cracking under repeated, monstrously powerful blows. At the same time, the assault on the front of the cabin resumed. The heavy thuds started again on the main door, and the scraping and tearing at the window where we'd placed the table. They were coordinating their attack, pressing us from two sides. This was it. This was the end of the siege and the beginning of the final confrontation. The door to the utility room was beginning to buckle. A long, dark claw punched through the wood near the top panel. Then another. They were literally tearing the door apart with their hands. I looked at Jake. His face was grim, set. The fear was still there, but it was overlaid with a cold resolve. We weren't going to die cowering in a corner. "The fireplace," I said, my voice hoarse. "Get on the other side, funnel them." It was a last-ditch tactical thought from a lifetime of training. The massive stone fireplace jutted out into the room, creating a natural choke point. If we stood on either side of it, they couldn't come at us both at once. We could concentrate our fire. Jake nodded, understanding immediately. We scrambled into position, our backs against the cold stone, rifles raised. The door to the utility room finally gave way with a deafening crash. The chest of drawers we'd used as a barricade was thrown across the room as if it weighed nothing. A colossal figure filled the doorway. In the combined beams of our flashlights, I saw one of them clearly for the first time. It was magnificent and horrifying. It stood easily 7.5, maybe 8 feet tall, but it was hunched, its massive shoulders stooped. Its body was a grotesque fusion of man and wolf. The legs were bent like a dog's, with reversed knees, ending in huge, paw-like feet that allowed it to stand upright. The torso was heavily muscled, tapering to a narrow waist, all covered in that same coarse, dark brown fur. Its arms were the most disturbing part. They were too long for its body, hanging down almost to its knees. And at the end of those arms were those 5-fingered, clawed hands. But the head was pure nightmare fuel. A long, lupine snout filled with yellowed fangs, lips pulled back in a permanent snarl. And the eyes, those burning, intelligent yellow eyes. They weren't looking at the room. They were looking at us. At our rifles. It took a step into the room, and the floorboards groaned under its weight. It let out a low growl, and from behind it, we could hear the other one, the bigger one, still battering at the front of the cabin. This was the one that had killed Brian. It held its head low, sniffing the air, its gaze flicking between me and Jake. It was assessing. It was thinking. I fired. Jake fired a split second later. We both aimed for center mass. The bullets hit the creature with wet, meaty thuds. It roared in pain and fury, staggering back a step, but it didn't fall. It hunched over, clutching at its chest, and a dark, thick liquid began to mat the fur. Any other animal, a bear, a deer, would have been knocked down or killed outright by 2 high-powered rifle rounds at that range. This thing just got angry. It lowered its head and charged. It moved with an unnatural, loping gait that covered the 10 feet between us in 2 bounds. It came at me. I tried to bring my rifle up for another shot, but it was too fast. A long arm swung out, and one of its clawed hands caught the barrel of my rifle. I felt a wrenching force that nearly tore my arms from their sockets. The weapon was ripped from my grasp and thrown across the room, clattering against the far wall. I was disarmed. I stumbled back, my feet tangling, and fell hard against the stone of the fireplace. The creature was on me, its foul, hot breath washing over my face. It smelled of carrion and wet fur. Its head was inches from mine, those yellow eyes burning with a hateful fire. I could see the individual fangs, the saliva dripping from its jaws. I threw my hands up in a useless gesture of defense. This was how I was going to die. Torn apart on the floor of a hunting cabin by something that shouldn't exist. Then Jake acted. He didn't fire again. The other creature was still trying to get in, and he knew he couldn't risk an empty rifle. He reversed his own weapon, gripping it like a club, and swung the heavy stock with all his might into the side of the creature's head. There was a sickening crack of wood on bone. The creature shrieked, a piercing, agonized sound, and recoiled from me, shaking its massive head. It turned its attention to Jake. It forgot about me completely. With a guttural roar, it lunged at him. Jake tried to backpedal, to bring his rifle back around, but the creature was too quick. It closed the distance and swiped at him with its claws. Jake cried out and fell, his rifle skittering away into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. My rifle was gone, Jake's was out of reach. We were helpless. The creature stood over Jake, who was clutching his arm, blood welling between his fingers. It raised its hand for a final, killing blow. At that exact moment, the front door of the cabin, weakened by the relentless assault, finally burst open. The second creature, the larger one, stormed in. It was even bigger than the first, maybe a foot taller, its fur almost black. It stopped just inside the doorway, its bulk filling the entire frame. For a second, the two monsters just stood there, framing a scene of absolute horror. But the arrival of the second creature was our salvation. The one standing over Jake paused. It turned its head and let out a series of sharp, barking yaps. It was communicating with the larger one. The big one answered with a low growl. It was a command. The first creature, the one Jake had injured, looked down at him, then back at its superior. It seemed to hesitate, a low whine escaping its throat. It wanted to finish the kill. Then, through the shattered windows and the open doors, a new light began to filter into the cabin. A faint, gray, pre-dawn light. The long night was finally ending. The larger creature at the door seemed to notice it. It let out another sharp, commanding bark. This time, the injured one obeyed. It backed away from Jake, giving him one last hateful glare from its yellow eyes. It turned and loped towards the door, its movements now seeming more urgent, less confident. The big one backed out of the doorway, melting into the shadows outside. The injured one followed, limping slightly. They were retreating. The dawn was coming, and for whatever reason, they did not want to be caught in the light. They were creatures of the night, and their time was over. We heard their heavy footfalls moving away from the cabin, crashing through the underbrush as they fled back into the deep woods. Then, silence. I crawled over to Jake. He was alive, but in bad shape. The claws had laid his forearm open to the bone. He was pale and going into shock. I grabbed a dish towel and wrapped it tightly around the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "We have to go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to go right now." They were gone, but they could come back, or others could come. We couldn't find my rifle in the dark and debris. We retrieved Jake's, but he was in no condition to use it. I helped him to his feet. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. We staggered out of the ruined cabin and into the gray twilight of the new day. The scene was one of utter devastation. The porch was destroyed, the doors and windows smashed, and there, near the edge of the woods, was a dark stain on the ground and a few scraps of torn fabric, all that was left of Brian. We didn't look back. I half-carried, half-dragged Jake toward the spot where we had parked my truck. My only thought was escape. Get to the truck, get down the mountain, get to civilization. Every shadow looked like a monster. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of their return. My adrenaline was the only thing keeping me moving. We reached the truck, a blessed island of metal and machinery in this primitive hell. I fumbled for my keys, my hands still shaking uncontrollably. I got the passenger door open and helped Jake inside. He slumped against the seat, his face ashen. I ran around to the driver's side, got in, and jammed the key into the ignition. I turned it. Nothing. A click. I tried again. Click. The battery was dead. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel in a fit of pure, helpless rage. I looked at the battery gauge. It was full. It wasn't the battery. I popped the hood and got out, Jake's rifle in my hand. I lifted the hood and my heart sank. The main battery cables had been severed, not chewed through. They had been cut, cleanly, as if with a pair of heavy-duty snips. They had thought of everything. They had disabled the generator, and they had disabled our vehicle. It wasn't random violence. It was a planned, systematic hunt. They cut the cables, I told Jake, my voice flat with defeat. He just closed his eyes. We were still 5 miles from the main gravel road, and miles more from any hope of help. Jake couldn't walk that far. He was losing blood. I made a decision. I had to go for help. I found the first aid kit in the truck and did my best to properly bandage Jake's arm. I gave him the 2 bottles of water we had and a protein bar. I left him the rifle. Lock the doors, I told him. Don't open them for anything. I'm going to run. I'll send help. He just nodded, his eyes glassy. Leaving him there was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. He was a sitting duck. But it was our only chance. I started down the dirt track at a jog. The sun was up now, but it offered little comfort. The woods on either side of the road felt menacing, watchful. I was unarmed, exhausted, and terrified. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. Every time a squirrel chittered or a branch fell, I flinched, expecting an 8-foot-tall horror to step out of the trees. The 5 miles to the gravel road felt like 100. It took me nearly 2 hours to reach the wider road. My body was screaming, but I didn't stop. I knew Jake's time was running out. I kept going, half running, half walking. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of an engine. A beat-up logging truck came rattling around a bend. I stood in the middle of the road and waved my arms frantically. The driver, a grizzled man with a weary face, slammed on his brakes. He looked at my torn clothes, my wild eyes, and the blood on my shirt. To his credit, he didn't ask too many questions. He just told me to get in. I told him my friend was hurt, that we'd had an accident. I didn't dare tell him the truth. He had a radio in his cab, and he called it in. Within an hour, I was sitting in the waiting room of the small county sheriff's office. A deputy had taken my initial statement, a simple story about a bear attack. Another team of deputies, along with a paramedic, had gone up the mountain with the logger to guide them back to my truck. The sheriff finally came out to talk to me. He was a big man with a tired, skeptical face. He listened patiently as I, exhausted and in shock, tried to tell him the real story. I told him about the buck, the tracks, the creatures, Brian. I could see the disbelief hardening in his eyes with every word I spoke. When I was finished, he just sighed. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice laced with a weary condescension. "You've been through a trauma. Your friend is dead. Your other friend is seriously injured. A big bear can do a lot of strange things when it's agitated. It can seem unreal." He told me they'd found my truck and that Jake was being airlifted to a hospital in Johnson City. They had also found what was left of Brian. The official cause of death, he informed me, would be an animal attack. A bear. "It wasn't a bear," I insisted, my voice cracking. "I know what a bear looks like. I know what a bear can do. This was different." I told him about the doorknob, the generator, the cut battery cables. He just shook his head. "Panic does funny things to the mind, sir. You see things that aren't there. You misinterpret things. As for the cables, squirrels chew through wires all the time." He was patronizing, dismissive. He had already written his report in his head. A tragic hunting accident. 2 old-timers and a city kid get in over their heads. One panics and gets mauled by a bear. End of story. I was frustrated, angry, but most of all, I felt utterly alone. I had seen the impossible, and the world was telling me I was crazy. They kept me for a few more hours of questioning, but it was clear they weren't investigating. They were processing. They closed the case before it was ever really opened. The official story stood. Brian Murphy, deceased.
Jake Murphy, injured in a bear attack. Samuel Coleman, witness suffering from shock. The Unicoi Mountains were safe. It was just a bear. As I was leaving, a much older deputy stopped me by the door. He was a thin, wiry man with pale blue eyes that had seen too much. He looked around to make sure no one was listening. "I heard your story," he said quietly. "The real one." I just looked at him, too tired to argue anymore.
He leaned in closer. "My granddaddy was a logger up in those mountains. He used to tell stories about them. Said there were things that lived in the deep hollows that you don't want to ever meet. He said they were smart and they were mean and they hated people." The deputy looked me straight in the eye. "Don't you ever go back up there, you hear me? You let those mountains keep their secrets." He patted my arm and walked away, leaving me standing there with the first and only piece of validation I would ever receive. That was 3 years ago. Jake survived. He lost 2 fingers and has a network of hideous scars on his arm, but he lived. We don't talk about that night. We don't have to. We see it in each other's eyes. We tried to talk to Brian's family, but what could we say? We stuck to the official story. A bear. The lie feels like a stone in my gut. Jake sold the cabin and the land for a pittance to a timber company. He never wanted to see it again. I live in a small town in coastal Florida now. There are no mountains, no deep woods. The tallest thing on the horizon is a condominium. I don't hunt anymore. I don't even like to walk in parks after dark. The sound of a dog barking in the night can make me break out in a cold sweat. I have nightmares. I see yellow eyes in the dark. I hear that half howl, half scream in my sleep. I see Brian's face, his eyes wide with terror right before he ran out that back door. Survivor's guilt is a heavy burden. I know what I saw. They were real. They were intelligent. They were a family, or a pack, or a clan. They lived in that valley. The buck we found wasn't just a kill, it was their dinner. We had invaded their territory, their larder. We were intruders, and they eliminated the threat. Systematically, efficiently. The old deputy was right. There are things in this world, hidden away in the deep, dark corners, that have been here longer than us. Things we have forgotten, but that have not forgotten us. We build our cities and our highways, and we tell ourselves we have conquered the wild. We are wrong. We have only pushed it back. And sometimes, if you wander too far off the path, you will find that the wild is pushing back. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods, and the birds go silent, and you find something that just feels wrong, don't try to rationalize it. Don't be a skeptic. Turn around and walk away. Run, because you are not the apex predator there. You are just meat, and you are in their home.